Good evening, everyone. My name is Doug Kreiner, the Faculty Director of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell University. The Institute's mission is to broaden and deepen public discourse and understanding of domestic and international affairs. We are particularly excited for this evening's debate, engaging the concerns and issues facing our local community in the Finger Lakes. Before we begin, I'd like to invite all of you to join us for the Institute's rich fall slate of programming. To find out more, please check us out on the web at iopga.cornell.edu. We hope to see you again at a future event. It's now my pleasure to welcome everyone to this evening's candidate debate for the New York State Senate from District 58. We are very grateful to the incumbent, Senator Tom O'Mara, and to the challenger, Leslie Danks Burke, for taking the time to be with us here this evening. Thank you again both for sharing the evening with us. I would also like to thank this evening's moderators, Sabrina Karim and Ali Cerrone, both professors of government at Cornell. Cornell University does not endorse any candidates, but we are pleased to be able to host this evening's forum for the benefit of the general public. For those with friends and neighbors unable to join us this evening, the event will be recorded and posted on our website. We would appreciate you sharing this information with interested voters who weren't able to be here with us. Our format for the evening is as follows. We will begin with 2-minute opening statements from both candidates. Then we will proceed with a series of pre-selected questions proposed by Professor Cerrone. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer the question, followed by 1 minute each to respond to the arguments of the other candidate, with additional short responses at the discretion of the moderator. Shortly before 7:15, we will break for a 5-minute intermission, during which we will share information about voting in this somewhat unusual year. Following the intermission, our second moderator, Professor Karim, will ask questions submitted by the audience, both in advance during registration and during the first half of the debate this evening. We invite audience members to submit additional questions now. At any point during the first half of our program, you can submit questions using the questions and answers feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The evening will conclude with closing statements in reverse order to the opening statements. And now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Professor Cerrone to get us started. Thank you, Ali.
Excellent. Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to moderate the first portion of this evening. First, we will have opening statements. Senator O'Mara, you won the toss, so you have 2 minutes whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Good evening. There's plenty of issues for us to address that are very important this evening, but in opening, I will start here. I've spent my entire life in this region. I was born and raised in Horseheads in Chemung County, grew my career in public service here. My wife Marilyn and I have raised our own family of 3 children here in Big Flats. 2020 has been a year of crisis for far too many workers, small business owners, nonprofits, farmers, families, and entire communities. Being involved in government and community life over these years, I have always been struck by this fact. When our backs are to the wall, regional representatives and citizens at every level, regardless of political party or ideology or anything else that gets in the way of effective government in other places. Around here, more often than not, we turn to a long tradition of pulling together to get the job done. And while there is always more to do, we have gotten the job done. I'm proud of having played my part in securing in excess of $1.6 billion for Cornell over my years in the Senate and significant state funding for the Ithaca area, including environmental funding for the clean water, invasive species, harmful algal blooms. And that's important because let's face it, my political philosophy does not overlap a great deal with that of the greater Ithaca community. However, division, gridlock, petty politics, or personal attacks are not what defines the nuts and bolts of government for our region. My office has become a command center of public outreach and response, working with government leaders at all levels and directly helping thousands with assistance for unemployment, housing, utilities, food, you name it. We've been there for the citizens of the Finger Lakes and the Southern Tier. It has solidified my resolve to serve. I promise to keep joining together with all of you to keep doing our best like we always have. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Ms. Danks Burke, now you have 2 minutes whenever you're ready.
Hello. Thank you very much to the Cornell Institute of Politics and Global Affairs and to the 3 faculty members who have put this together. You folks are extraordinarily competent now after months of doing Zoom meetings and leading discussions by Zoom, and I know that you're going to lead us all through a very productive discussion this evening, and I appreciate that. I also have to give a quick shout out to the members of UAW Local 2300, who are the thousands of staff at Cornell University. UAW Local 2300 has endorsed my race, and I just want to put a quick shout out to the staff, the many cafeteria workers, all the folks at Cornell University who make sure that Cornell goes round each day. And thank you very much, Mr. O'Meara, for joining this debate. And a special thanks to every single voter who is tuning in tonight to participate, as our Constitution expects us to be full participants in the democratic process. It's a true honor to be here. I'm Leslie Danks Burke, and I'm asking for your vote for State Senate because I see that the taxes here are through the roof, and yet we are not getting the funding back that we deserve or that we're paying into the system. We've had decades of neglect here, and the COVID pandemic has put that neglect into stark relief. Schools that were underfunded before the pandemic are now struggling to get Chromebooks and devices to children all across the district, some of whom live in food insecure homes and many of whom do not have access to any digital technology whatsoever. We were left behind before COVID hit, and now it's worse. We have serious problems, and we need serious leadership to get out of it. My opponent, Senator O'Meara, has been there 15 years, and I think we can't keep making the same choice and expecting things to get better. We live in a beautiful Southern Tier and Finger Lakes region. We have every opportunity ahead of us, and I'm ready to get in there and fight hard for our fair share. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks to both of you for your opening statements. Now we will begin the more traditional format of the debate. Just a reminder, I will read each question in its entirety, and then I will give the first candidate 2 minutes to speak. The other candidate will then have 1 minute, and then 30-second responses at my discretion. So Ms. Danks Burke, you will be the first one to respond on the first question, and then Senator O'Meara will be the second responder. So, first question. There have been numerous calls recently in this district to defund the police. First, do you support reallocating funds from police departments to other municipal and county services? And second, what role should the state play in police reform? So, Leslie, you have 2 minutes whenever you're ready.
So I want to be very clear. I do not support removing funding from our law enforcement. We here in the Southern Tier and the Finger Lakes have struggled mightily under cuts to municipal funding, to school funding, to law enforcement funding over the last decade. And that is really the central tenet of my campaign, that we are paying a whole lot of money into the system and we aren't getting the return back. My question to my opponent is, why did you vote for the past 2 years for municipal funding cuts that resulted in cuts to law enforcement? And why isn't my opponent standing up to the President of the United States and to the US Senate, which are both in his political party, to demand funding for municipalities? What I think your question is really going to the heart of, though, is whether our law enforcement is doing a good enough job. And that's a question that we certainly should explore in greater detail in this debate. It's absolutely clear that there's a different system of rules in place for Black and brown people in our community than there is for white people. And that is something that absolutely must be addressed.
Okay, great, excellent. Also, I forgot to mention the candidates were gracious enough to let us use their first names, which are slightly quicker. So thank you for that. Tom, you have 1 minute to respond.
Okay. 1 minute or 2 minutes? So what are the order here?
You have 1 minute since you're the second one.
Oh,
You'll
okay.
have 2 minutes if you
All
start
right.
the next question.
Fine with me. Thank you. That's a critically important question, given the tumultuous times that we are in right now. We have a crisis in our country, and we're seeing it right here as close as Rochester, New York, with the issues in our communities. I do not support the efforts to defund our police. I think we need to be supporting our police more than ever right now. We need to be making sure that the appropriate resources are provided to allow the police to do their jobs. We have certainly seen incidents across the country and right here in Rochester that cause alarm for the treatment of individuals by the police. But that is by far the few, and we need to respect our police and continue to fund them appropriately so that they can do the job they're here to protect and serve.
Great. Leslie, would you like to respond for 30 seconds?
Sure. In addition to keeping the funding for our law enforcement, and I certainly don't want to live in a community that does not have law enforcement, what we need to do is increase our support for addiction services, for mental health services, for education. And I do not believe that that needs to be tied to any cuts for services for law enforcement. But what does need to happen is that law enforcement personnel need to have the resources and the training to be able to do the job that we're asking them to do. And right now, the cuts to mental health services, the cuts across the board that have happened on Senator Tom O'Mara's watch have drastically reduced our ability to provide for those in our community who are most in need.
Excellent. Tom, would you like one 30-second response?
Sure. In regards to the mental health services, the state, with the leadership of Governor Cuomo, has been leading the way in cutting psychiatric and mental health services in New York State. My first year in the Senate, I had to fight tooth and nail to save the Elmira Psychiatric Center from closure at the hands of Governor Cuomo. We saved that facility. Yet, in the meantime, Governor continues to limit beds, reduce them administratively, and not provide appropriate support to the not-for-profit community of mental health services in our communities to where the governor wants to send these individuals.
Great, thank you. That concludes the first question. So we'll move on to the second question, and now in reverse order. So Tom, you'll get the first 2 minutes, and Leslie, you'll get 1, and then 30-second responses. So the second question, the New York Times recently published an article that said the pandemic will take women 10 years back in the workplace due to the unequal burden of childcare that women are facing. What types of legislation would you support to prevent this from happening? So whenever you're ready, Tom.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that article. Taking us 10 years back in the workplace, I certainly do not see that. We have done some incredible work over the recent years with improving conditions for women in the workplace. I've been supportive of those. There's always more to be done, but I don't see that this pandemic is going to take women back in the workplace by 10 years. Certainly we have concerns with childcare and the overlapping concerns with education and whether the children are in school or not in school. We need to be able to provide the support, and we should provide the support for those working women that are required to stay home and care for their children while they're not in school.
Great, thank you. Leslie, you have 1 minute.
Senator O'Mara and I first met when I was an advocate for the women's equality agenda several years back, and I was in the job of, as a volunteer, leading buses of women to Albany to visit with legislators, including Senator Tom O'Mara, for the sorts of protections that we need to have for women and for all families in the workplace, including paid family leave, including healthcare changes, including childcare. And there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that this pandemic is putting into stark relief challenges that we have had for decades and that there is a serious rollback in need here in the Southern Tier and the Finger Lakes and all across the state of New York. I, for one, would like to see, and I am joined by many, many business leaders of all genders, of all political persuasions, who believe that childcare is the single greatest challenge to getting our economy back on track. And if you think about it pragmatically, that's right. If parents can't go to work, get the job done. So absolutely, we need to focus on childcare in these coming years.
Okay, thank you very much. Tom, would you like to respond?
Just to the extent that we 2 years ago passed the expansions of the Family Leave Act in New York State to provide much extended relief for individual of any gender that needs to stay home for caring for their children or even a sick parent. So we have made strides, and those strides were made while we had a Republican majority in the state Senate. So I'm fully supportive of these efforts.
Great. And then Leslie, last response, 30 seconds.
Well, it took a very long time, Tom. I remember being in your office many, many times. So I'm very glad that we finally were able to get the Women's Equality Agenda passed, but it did take quite a while.
Okay. Okay, now we'll move on to question 3. Question 3, we have all seen the impact of COVID-19 on local economies and the state budget. Given that municipal, county, and state budget will take a large hit, by some estimates up to 11 to 15% for the entire state, do you have a better plan to raise revenue for the state than your opponent? And I'll go ahead, sorry, Leslie is starting first.
Definitely, I have a better plan because we know what Mr. O'Meara's plan is. He's been in office for 15 years, and his plan every year has been to go right along with the tax increases that keep families and businesses held back. For many, many years, Mr. O'Meara has voted in favor of a tax structure that puts hugely regressive property taxes onto our local businesses, our entrepreneurs, and our working families in their effort to get out from under the burden and start to make a go of it here in the Southern Tier and the Finger Lakes. What I want to see happen is I want to see those regulatory and tax burdens lessened, whacked in half in some places by making the folks who currently don't carry their weight, and that's the billionaires in New York City who don't pay any tax at all effectively, make them carry their fair share. I would like to see the Southern Tier and the Finger Lakes have the real opportunity to get ahead and succeed by making the folks who are funding the politicians at all levels in New York State and at the federal level as well, pay their fair share. We also need to cut expenses. There's no doubt that New York State has a very bloated budget. I can't figure out where the money goes. Mr. O'Meara's been there for a long time, so presumably he's studied this. And he can educate us tonight where all that funding goes. But we put a lot of money into, for example, school systems and economic development systems that simply don't get the job done. And that's on every single legislator who's been there for this entire time voting in favor of keeping this system in place.
Great, thank you. Tom, you have 1 minute.
Yes, thank you. That's a critical question, and it's been at the forefront of my work for my time that I've been in Albany. The economy and job creation is critical, that we're able to provide the opportunity to our citizens to be able to have a decent job, to be able to support a family, so there's opportunities for our children to return home, to prosper here. It's the overburdened tax structure in New York State as a whole that has kept the economy back in New York. I fought against it since I've been there. I was responsible for removing the franchise tax on manufacturers in New York State because I believe in a strong manufacturing economy will be the base to let other things grow. I've been a constant fighter for that. I'm proud to have consistently had the support of the New York State Manufacturers Association and the New York State Business Council and the New York State Federation of Independent Business. That is the largest association in New York that oversees small business. They're aware of the work I've done, and that's why I've been endorsed by these individuals. But low taxes. We have the lowest middle income tax rate in our country right now that we've had in 70 years. We have been making efforts to cut these taxes and these burdens, and I will continue to do that.
Okay, thank you. Leslie, you have 30 seconds to respond.
Sure. I think that your question was particularly going to COVID and what we're going to be doing in the COVID era. And I think that Senator O'Meara's and my responses both show that the challenges that we're having here in the Southern Tier and the Lakes significantly predate COVID. They're just in stark relief now. And as soon as the New York State went on pause back in March, I put out a 10-point call for action for small business relief. The legislature was in session after that, and I didn't see a single bit of movement on that. So we need real attention to upstate New York, and we need it now.
Okay, Tom, 30 seconds.
I'm good, thank you.
Okay, excellent. We'll move on to the fourth question, which is about polarization. So polarization is a defining feature of the year 2020. Candidates and voters on both the left and the right hold sizable differences in opinion on a range of issues, both social and economic. And the problem is there seems to be no middle ground, especially in a district with a diverse ideological spectrum such as ours. Do you believe that you are better at forging compromise with senators of the opposing party than your opponent?
I certainly do. We have worked as a slim Republican majority for the first 8 years of myself in the Senate, working across the aisle to get things done with a heavy Democrat majority in the state assembly and a Democrat governor. We have worked and made amazing compromise, far more compromise and progress forward than we've seen at the federal level. I have demonstrated over my years in office throughout my district, and it shows no greater anywhere than right here in Tompkins County in Ithaca, where, as I said in the opening statement, we don't share a lot of common basic philosophies of politics. However, I have worked extensively and closely with local government leaders throughout the time I've been in office to deliver resources to help with the bureaucratic roadblocks we get in Albany. I've been proud to work across the aisle with our locals and in Albany, and I have a demonstrated track record of doing that.
Excellent, thank you. Leslie, you have 1 minute.
Sure, I'm gonna actually disagree with the premise, if I may. I don't think that we are as divided as conventional wisdom would like to have us believe. And I know that in my own travels in seeking to earn this district's vote, I have encountered so many people who have much more in common with each other than divides us. I did hear Mr. O'Meara say in his opening remarks that he has vastly different views than folks in Ithaca. And I'm not sure that's all that true, that folks in Ithaca are, somehow dramatically different from other folks in the rest of the district or vice versa. In my view, we've got a lot in common, and that showed itself in our matchup in 2016. In 2016, this district was 32% Democratic, and I earned 45% of the vote. That means that there was a substantial number of people who crossed the aisle and voted for me instead of for Senator O'Meara. That says to me that people are willing to think outside the box and work with the other side to get ahead.
Okay, great. So we're getting a lot of questions from the audience and some very compelling questions. So we're going to add 2 more to this traditional debate style format. They're really interesting, so we beg your indulgence. Okay, so the next question, which I'm going to move on to now, and it's Leslie's turn to begin, talks about homelessness, actually, and housing issues in the district. So there are currently no bills under discussion regarding homelessness in a time where residential evictions and general housing insecurity are rapidly increasing. Do you believe that you have a better proposal to fix this policy issue compared to your opponents?
So I'm imagining that this question came from someone in Ithaca, because I know that the homelessness situation and the housing crisis in Ithaca is very much top of mind here, but it certainly is something that is relevant all across the district as well. From my perspective, what we need to do on the housing front is take a real hard look, not just inside the city of Ithaca, inside the municipal boundaries, and not even just inside Tompkins County, and making sure that there is transportation and housing for people all across this region. 30% of Schuyler County's workforce commutes into Tompkins County every day. And if housing prices in Tompkins County skyrocket, then not only is that going to harm the folks who are unable to afford to live anywhere near their homes, it also is going to hurt the very communities that are currently reliant on that transitory population that's moving in on a daily basis to work here. What I think we need to take a really close look at is what our housing needs are across the entire region, and make sure that the wealthiest among us are doing our part in securing the future for the entire region.
Great, thank you. Tom, you have 1 minute.
Housing is a critical issue in every one of our communities and across New York State. COVID is highlighting that more than ever. You know, we're in a holding pattern right now under COVID with no evictions being allowed. When that ends, I am very concerned of what the flood of eviction proceedings is going to be and how the courts deal with this. There's very vague language right now that says that if a tenant had a hardship due to COVID and couldn't pay their rent, then even after this, they won't be evicted from their apartment, but the landlord will get a money judgment against them. By and large, those are generally very, very rarely collectible by a landlord, but it will help keep the tenants in these facilities going forward. We have done a significant amount of tenant relief forward during this COVID period, and a little bit on the landlord side. And we have to remember that the landlords still have to pay the property taxes. They still have to pay the insurance. They still have to pay the mortgage bills. So they need to be taken into consideration as well with whatever relief package we have is going forward, because we're going to have a real crisis when this current crisis ends and the eviction proceedings are allowed to move forward in our housing courts.
Okay, Leslie, your response.
Sure, I feel like I'm sort of beating a drum here, but to me, this goes back to the tremendously onerous property tax problem that we have here in the Southern Tier and the Finger Lakes and across all of New York. Right now, our property taxes are artificially inflated by 50% in order to float a Medicaid for profit program that lines the pockets of corporations. No other state handles Medicaid funding the way New York State does. And if we cut those property taxes by the 50% that we should, that would immediately, as Tom points out, reduce the burden not just on landlords, but also on the tenants who are having to pay rent to accommodate those property taxes. So we've got to get away from this regressive tax structure that's killing our families and our working people here, and toward a system where everybody can afford to live.
And Tom, your response.
Well, on that last point by Leslie, I would argue that there's nobody in Albany that's done more than me to fight the unfunded mandate of Medicaid. It's the reason I got into legislative office to begin with, having served as Chemung County attorney. We have put a cap and a freeze on Medicaid spending costs to the counties. It's resulted in Census Institution an estimated over $20 billion in savings across the state for counties on their Medicaid expenses. It's now increasing over $4 billion a year of savings off the county property tax bill. Yet there still remains a $7 billion burden that I have sponsored legislation every year I've been in Albany to remove that full burden from the counties and lower our property taxes. It's the Democratic leadership that Leslie wants to join in Albany that has been preventing that from happening.
Okay, so we'll move to the final question, which is related to what we were just talking about. It has to do with healthcare. So question 6, do you support the New York Health Act? Why or why not? And this is Tom's turn to have the first 2-minute response. So Tom, whenever you're ready.
Yes, I have been clear throughout my years in office that I oppose the New York Health Act. The New York Health Act would cost the state of New York well over $200 billion. Nobody disagrees that New York State already has a bloated budget of $176 billion, but we're going to impact that by roughly another $200 million. And in the process, we're going to take away people's insurance that they have now. It's not going to be available. There are major federal stumbling blocks with being able to do this in the state. And if you want to see the economy in New York State downturn even more, then add this burden onto the taxpayers of New York State. What we need to focus on in New York, and what I have been focusing on in New York, is that percentage of people that fall between those that are eligible for Medicaid and those that don't have insurance. That's estimated to be about 1 million people in New York State. And we can spend a heck of a lot less money trying to solve that issue than reworking and revamping over 20% of our economy at over $200 billion a year to put a New York Health Act in that would devastate the economy of New York.
Thank you. Leslie, you have 1 minute.
I do support the New York Health Act, and here's why. Because Tom is wrong. It will save us money. Let's take a look at Medicaid right now. In New York State, Medicaid is not single payer. It's a Medicaid for profit program that props up the corporations who donate to my opponent's campaign. What happens, and Comptroller Tom DiNapoli has done several studies that show this, is that billions of dollars get siphoned off of that Medicaid program to line the private for-profit insurers who are currently subcontracted with Medicaid. Medicaid right now covers 1 in 4 New Yorkers, and the fact that it is used as a bloated system for lining corporate profits is just one indicator of how a single-payer healthcare system across the state would actually reduce costs on small businesses, reduce costs on working families, and cut taxes across the board.
Tom, your response?
Yeah, I would say that there's not, frankly, one respectable think tank around Albany or the country that think this is not going to extensively cost New York State taxpayers a lot. In fact, someone who I rarely agree with and constantly am at odds with, our governor, Andrew Cuomo, understands that, and he's opposed to the New York Health Act. And we are certainly not on the same page, he and I, on our thoughts and views on where we need to take New York State.
Leslie?
So Tom says that a lot, that he is not supportive of the governor. He puts out a lot of press releases, he wears t-shirts, he has rallies. But actually, if you look at Tom O'Mara's votes, he votes consistently in favor of Governor Cuomo's budgets that increase our property taxes and that prop up this Medicaid for profit system. So Tom may very well say that he's standing up against this and run on that as a campaign platform. But when you go back and look at the actual votes, there's no there. And we absolutely need to get out from under the thumb of these huge medical corporations that are donating millions of dollars, both to Democrats like Governor Cuomo and to my opponent's campaigns.
Excellent. So thank you to both candidates for a really stimulating debate. We're going to continue this with the town hall portion in a little bit, but first we will move to intermission. And Professor Karim will talk about some information about voting, but also for all of you attendees, if you'd like to submit questions, just a reminder, there's a Q&A feature. You can go ahead and submit any late breaking questions you might have after hearing the first part of this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and turn over to Professor Karim, and thanks a lot for a good first half.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we will take 5 minutes, and Tom and Leslie, feel free to take a little bit of a rest if you'd like. But we'll be going over voting and how to vote given kind of the strange circumstances this year. So we're just waiting for the slides to come up for that.
Okay, I'm going to go on mute and stop my video, but I'll still be here.
Okay, I should preface this by saying that this information is for Tompkins County only, just because the debate is being hosted here in Tompkins County. And so please look up your information if you do not live in Tompkins County, as it might be different. So I'll go over absentee voting. Absentee voting, the deadline to submit your applications. Here we go, sorry. So absentee voting here, so that we are authorized to be able to vote by mail as a result of the bill that was passed. Ballots will be available starting October 2nd, but in order to get a ballot, you have to submit an application, and you can find this application online. There's various ways to obtain the application. If we could go to that slide. So you can call the Board of Elections to request an application to be mailed to you. You can go online and select forms at votetompkins.com and download the ballot, or I'm sorry, not the ballot, the application to get the ballot. You can stop by at the Board of Elections, which is on 128 East Buffalo Street, to get an application. And then there's also, again, a portal that you can use to get the application. So once you have the application and you filled it out, the deadline is October 27th, and you can mail, fax, or email that. And there's multiple ways to do that. So you can mail it to 128 East Buffalo Street, you can scan it and email it, you can fax it at that number, or you can deliver it in person. Again, this is only for the application. So once you've submitted the application, then you will receive a ballot by mail, and as the previous slide showed, that will start October 2nd. If you do not want to vote by mail and you feel comfortable voting in person, there is early voting that is starting on October 24th. There are 2 locations for that. The Town of Ithaca Town Hall, which is on 215 North Tioga Street, it's downtown Ithaca, or the Crash Fire Rescue, which is on 72 Brown Road by the Tompkins County Airport. And what you have here are the dates that early voting is available and the times that you can go to vote early. And that is, it's recommended to do everything early, just because there are, just to make sure that there are no problems with anything, it's better to go in early and vote. That's why it's available. In addition to that, so yeah, you can also vote on election day. Normally, you can find where your polling stations are. You can look up what the ballot will look like, and election day is November 3rd. Polls are open from 6 to 9 p.m. And lastly, Cornell is sponsoring a number of voting drives, but the last one is October 5th. And so there's a link here that will be sent out that you can use to participate in this voting drive. We have some other resources available as well. We go to those. Okay, we have some other resources available as well. If anybody would like those, we can put them in the chat function, so you can look up the links directly if you would like. And so we will return in about 2 minutes. So at 7:15, we will start back up. So we'll give the audience a little bit of a break as well. Okay, we can start to come back. We can transition to the next part of the debate. Great, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for continuing to participate. So we have some questions from the audience, but we received a lot of questions as well in advance. And so I will be, I've basically taken the ones that we received in advance and looked at the number of similarities in terms of themes and tried to ask those questions. So I'll try to prioritize those, the ones that received the most amount of kind of similarity in terms of questions. And then if we have time, we'll take some from the audience, which I think we will. And I will also do a rapid round. So just to remind you, we will give you 2 minutes each. So this is not a rebuttal. There's not a back and forth. This is just give us your answer to the question. And then we will move on to the next question after that, until we get to the rapid round in that case, and I'll go over the rules for that. Okay.
Excuse me, how long again for each response?
2 minutes. You'll
Okay,
get 2 minutes. And it's the similar format where I will in the chat give you 30 seconds and 10 seconds. So we will this time start with Leslie as well, and then we will just go back and forth. So I will start with the first question. How high do you rank climate change and other environmental issues among your campaign priorities? What are your specific plans to address climate change?
Climate change is an existential threat, and we are experiencing it right now. We see how it's changing our communities in fundamental ways. Some of the first people to see the climate change impact here in our region have been farmers who have had to adjust their growing seasons, who have had to adjust to bouts of severe drought followed by severe rain. We just are in the process of coming out of a drought period right now. I've talked to a lot of farmers just in the last several days who are struggling with their crops because of what we're experiencing. So there's absolutely no doubt that climate change is here and that we are behind in our mitigation and our adaptation efforts. What we need to do is start investing in the infrastructure that has been long overdue in this area so that our bridges, our culverts, all of our resources can withstand the onslaught that's coming at us. And we also need to prepare for the future. So we need to do both of those things simultaneously, clean up the mess that we have behind us and get ready for what's coming.
Yes, thank you. You know, my top priorities of the work that I do in Albany certainly start with jobs and taxes and providing opportunity to New Yorkers. But hand in hand with economic development and lowering taxes goes dealing with climate change and how we adapt and become more resilient going forward. So we have less expensive damage when we have these microburst storms and other incidents that we have been seeing with increasing regularity. You know, I have been fortunate in my tenure in the state Senate to have served several years as the chairman of the Environmental Conservation Committee, where I helped rebuild the Environmental Protection Fund back to its level, its highest level ever. It had been greatly reduced from the 2009 recession. I have worked extensively on our clean water infrastructures with billions of dollars going to local municipalities to help deal with responses and building the strength of our systems. I have worked closely with Cornell University in providing money for a pollinator study to help with what's happening with our bees. I've helped with funding for redoing what's called a golden nematode lab, which deals with invasive species for potato growers across New York, something that the college has been doing for 80 years or so, and the lab needed to be redone. I have been there to provide this type of relief and efforts to deal with climate change in any number of ways. Climate change is intertwined right now with every decision we're making at every level of government. It's extremely important, and I have been doing my part for what I can do with helping with our response and moving forward. And I think New York State has done far more than any other state than what we've done to deal with climate change, with greenhouse gases, certainly with renewable energy.
Thank you very much. So I'm actually going to ask a follow-up question that is actually from the student newspaper at Cornell that was just sent to us that's related to this topic as well. So they ask, Cornell just announced a moratorium on Cornell just announced a moratorium on all future fossil fuel investments, a de facto divestment. There are many community leaders in New York calling for the passage of the Fossil Fuel Divestment Act, which would require the comptroller to divest the state common retirement fund. Do you support this bill? And we will start with Tom and then go to
I absolutely do not support this bill. The sole job of the comptroller of the state of New York as the sole trustee of our retirement funds in New York, and that's one of the really solid things that New York State has, is a solidly well-funded retirement system. Many other states have concerns over the ability of their funds to meet the demands. New York consistently ranks in the top 5 in the country with our fund, and that has to do with the investment opportunities that the controller makes as a sole trustee, and should have the responsibility and only be looking at returns on investment. It is not the controller's job, who's looking out for increases to investments, making sure our retirement fund is solid, needs to be the #1 focus.
Okay, great. Leslie.
So I applaud Cornell University for making the decision that it has made. And I do not think that the New York State Comptroller's Office should be forced by a legislature, which is made up of individual legislators who don't necessarily have that expertise, should not be forced by the legislature to make that decision. I do, however, applaud the direction that Comptroller John DiNapoli is going right now by moving toward a more divesting strategy. But just as I don't think that a legislature should be, determining medical decisions for doctors, I don't think that the legislature should be passing legislation that forces the comptroller's hand. One of the real assets that we have in New York State is that we do have an independent comptroller who is able to stand up to a very powerful governor and to a legislature simultaneously to make sure that the pension fund is protected from any political ransacking that might happen. Returning, though, to the question of climate change, and I'm glad that Senator O'Meara brought up his tenure as chair of the Environmental Conservation Committee. During that time, and actually since then, Senator O'Meara has also had a second job at a lobbying firm that represents many of the very companies that do pollute our environment. For example, Senator O'Meara's firm represents the company that trucks in fracking waste from Pennsylvania, and he was a decision maker in getting the legislation passed that allows that fracking waste to get trucked in. That sort of conflict of interest is allowed in New York State. There's no law in New York State apparently that prohibits that, but it doesn't make it right. And it deeply concerns me that our elected representatives are pushing forward on climate injuring proposals like this.
If I may respond briefly to that.
We can save that for actually the conclusion. So we're just doing 2 minutes for this round. But actually the next question. It's
baseless and wrong.
The next question is actually related, so that might give you an opportunity to respond. And we've gotten a number of questions about conflict of interest. And so the way that I would like to ask this question, and Tom, you are first, is do you believe it is appropriate to work full-time and work as a senator, in the sense having 2 jobs? And do you see that there is a conflict of interest in doing so? And then additionally, should there be limitations on outside income beyond salaries for state elected leaders? So Tom, that is for you.
I absolutely believe that legislators should be able to have a second job. My primary and principal job is representing the people in the 58th Senate District. I'm an attorney by trade. We have individuals in the state legislature that are farmers, that are small business owners, that are chiropractors, that are veterinarians, that are real estate agents. We need more people that are working in the real world, in the legislature with that. We have the strongest ethics laws in New York State, and I've supported those increases in those over the years. We are required to have our outside business practice reviewed by the Legislative Ethics Commission, which renders an advisory opinion on whether or not your role in the your work in the private sector creates any conflicts. My work has been thoroughly reviewed by the Legislative Ethics Commission. I have a advisory opinion issued to myself approving the work that I do. I have no involvement whatsoever with any activities before the state or any decisions, as Leslie alleged in the previous answer. It's false innuendo, and it's all too common of her campaign this year and 4 years ago.
Okay, Leslie, just to remind you, the question is about whether or not senators should work and have an additional job or work just as their primary job being the senator. And then should there be limitations on outside income beyond salaries for state elected leaders?
I do not believe that a senator in New York State should be allowed to be a senator and simultaneously an attorney at a lobbying firm where the clients have business before the Senate. Mr. O'Meara compares himself to a veterinarian or a farmer or a small business owner, but he isn't any one of those. What he is a lawyer at a law firm that represents corporations that have business before the Senate. One example is Honeywell. Senator O'Meara's law firm represents Honeywell. While he was chairman of the Environmental Conservation Committee, Honeywell was accused of dumping cancer-causing chemicals into the water in Hoosick Falls. Senator O'Meara, as chairman of the Environmental Conservation Committee, sat on the subpoenas and refused to release them, even though the ranking member, Brad Hoylman, regularly held press conferences demanding that that information be released.
Leslie, I issued those subpoenas. I didn't sit on them, and we made them public, and we allowed public access to view them.
So if we could avoid interruptions, that would be ideal.
So when we have a situation where a sitting senator is able to push legislation or push business of the Senate that benefits the corporate clients of his law firm, that to me is deeply problematic. It's very different from a veterinarian being your senator.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to transition from this topic to a different one, but it is still related to democratic principles. And that question is, some states like Colorado use a vote by mail system for all elections. Should New York State move to such a model? And Leslie, you are first.
New York State is way behind the rest of the country in terms of making it easier to vote. And that's something that unfortunately we need to address if we're going to continue to pride ourselves on being a forward-thinking state that has moved into the 21st century. I do think that there should be universal vote by mail for those who want to take advantage of that opportunity. I also think there are many other voting reforms that could make it easier for us to exercise our most important constitutional obligation, which is to hold our elected officials accountable. Voting is the one opportunity that every single one of us has over and over to have our say in what our elected officials are doing. And it's very clear that once we vote, those elected officials go off into other chambers, other legislative rooms, other bodies, and they vote over and over. So our votes have carrying weight, have power far beyond election day. And we should be taking that responsibility very seriously and making sure that every single person who wants to exercise that constitutional obligation is able to do so.
Okay, thank you. Tom?
I am fully supportive of increasing voter participation, presuming that it's done in a way that still provides for fair and unaltered elections. I do have concerns over voter fraud, and I do not think it's rampant, and I don't think it exists in our area of the world, but I do think it exists some places. I voted for the constitutional amendment to allow for no excuse absentee voting. That will come up in the next legislative session, as it's a constitutional amendment, requires 2 passages. I will vote for that again. I can tell you I support early voting, but I voted against the early voting bill in New York because it came with no funding for the county boards of elections that are charged with holding these elections. It's an extra expense. It's an extra unfunded mandate that Governor Cuomo all too typically does not follow through with. He talks a big game about it. And we've saved a great deal of money with the property tax cap that we've put in place, but the unfunded mandates have not stopped. And those burdens continue to increase on our county property taxpayers. So we have come a long ways in increasing voter accessibility. We need to make sure that we're diligent in moving forward with these, that we have security. And I oppose a full mail-in ballot without an absentee request feature of it, because we're seeing problems all across the country right now, as we thought we would, with ballots being mailed to people that haven't lived in those places for a long time. Our voter rolls are not as clean as they should be, and that's ripe for fraud.
Great, right on time. Thank you very much. Next, we are going to continue with this theme, and I'm going to ask a question about actually Governor Cuomo. And so Tom, this one will go to you first. Given that Governor Cuomo has extensive executive power, and New York is unique in that, what can individual state senators do to pass legislation that the governor may not agree with or threaten to veto?
Well, the legislature has to have a backbone and has to be willing to stand up to the governor. The majorities that we have in Albany right now are not willing to do that. They're not even willing to remove the governor's emergency powers that were granted at the beginning of this pandemic. And before I can, Leslie can beat me to the punch, yes, I supported that because it came with $40 million of COVID preparation funding, which unfortunately at the time, we thought $40 million was a great deal of money for this issue. And we've learned now that it's a drop in the bucket. But after the initial emergency of this pandemic moved on, the governor's powers should have ended. Myself and my colleagues have moved several times in Albany to get the Democratic majorities to end those emergency powers, which they can do with a simple concurrent resolution. And every Democrat in the state Senate and the state Assembly voted against ending the governor's emergency powers.
Great, thank you. Leslie?
Senator Tom O'Mara voted on April 3rd to expand Governor Cuomo's already supersized executive powers. You're right, Dr. Karim, that in New York State, the executive, the governor, has significantly more power than in most other states in the United States. And it must be that Senator O'Mara has a great deal of trust in our governor for him to have voted in favor of supersizing those powers even more. There were Republicans who voted against that. In our neighboring district, Senator George Borrello voted against that. There were also Democrats who voted against that, but Mr. O'Mara voted in favor of supersizing those powers. And I don't understand that. I think that we have a constitutional system of checks and balances, and I think that Mr. O'Mara should have held on to the legislative power that allows us to exercise those checks and balances. It's not about the personality in the governor's seat. It's about protecting and preserving our constitutional system of checks and balances. And to hear that Mr. O'Mara was willing to be bought off to sell off our constitutional checks and balances by $40 million is to me outrageous. We should not be bought off by that.
Okay, great. We're going to switch gears a little bit and switch questions to kind of a law enforcement and race theme. So you got a number of questions about those themes as well. So the first question I will ask is, what should be the relationship between state law enforcement and ICE? And that one goes to you, Leslie, first.
So again, just like I said in the last question, we have a constitutional system of checks and balances where the states have a certain amount of authority and the federal government reserves a certain amount of authority. And that's very important so that we don't have federal overreach. We're seeing federal overreach in a lot of ways right now, and ICE is one of those. We're also seeing that the federal government is stepping in across the board on budgetary questions. They're withholding municipal funding. They are managing healthcare in a way that is disenfranchising communities all across states, and states are able to stand up to that. And that's an important facet of our constitutional structure here in America. So I am very glad to see that in the federal overreach that we're seeing by ICE right now, that states such as New York are willing to stand up and preserve home rule and make sure that those sorts of inequities are not perpetrated on our turf.
Great, thank you. Tom?
I disagree with Leslie completely. The governor's actions in refusing to provide critical investigatory materials to law enforcement from our DMV databases of our borders, and confirming who is coming, who is going, checking their backgrounds. Limiting that information is dangerous for our law enforcement. Yes, we have a significant problem with immigration in this country. And we have many that are here undocumented. And that is a problem for our federal government to deal with. And I've been disappointed in their dealing with that, in their inability to come to some real direction on how to handle those that are undocumented in our country. But to have sanctuary cities and not have law enforcement cooperate between federal and state authorities is just dead wrong. To be providing driver's licenses to illegal immigrants is just wrong.
Okay, thank you. A second question along this theme is, and this will go to Tom first. Do you believe that there is such a thing as institutional racism? In general, what can be done to combat racism at the state level?
There's certainly racism at all levels of our communities, our state, our country. I do not buy into the fact that it is institutional or systemic. There are issues that need to be dealt with. I don't buy into the fact that every one of these incidents is racially motivated. Some, perhaps, are or were. Some may just be a blatant abuse of authority, which we have seen. And certainly in my years of working as a prosecutor, both in Manhattan and in Chemung County, I've seen bad cops, and they exist. But by and large, our law enforcement does a great job. They're out to protect and serve. You know, we passed a bunch of legislation in Albany this year to deal with further looking into disciplinary actions of police. I was the sole Republican to vote for a bill that would allow our Attorney General to have an independent disciplinary review board over all police agencies. Too many police agencies have internal review boards to deal with looking at their disciplinary actions. The public does not have confidence in that. It needs to be independent, and that's why I supported that. But to broad brush paint our law enforcement as racist is just completely wrong. It's uncalled for, and it is causing great disharmony within our country.
Great, thank you. And Leslie?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yes, I can. We'll go to where did it go? Sorry, do you believe that there is such a thing as institutional racism? In general, what can be done to combat racism at the state level?
I do believe that there is institutional racism, systemic racism in our country. In our 244 years of existence, we have strived over and over to reach the ideal that we put forth in our Constitution, that all are created equal. And let's remember that originally it said all men are created equal, and we've had some amendments to address that women are that group as well. And over the years, we've had to include other groups that were systemically disenfranchised right from the get-go. But we have always had this ideal that all created equal. And what our obligation is as citizens and once elected as legislators is to make sure that our rules live up to that ideal. Right now, our rules don't live up to that ideal. And we can see that very clearly. Black people are killed by the police 3.5 times more often than white people. That's a fact. That's an indication of a systemic problem. Black people have a significantly shorter life expectancy than white people. That's a fact. That's a systemic problem that endures for an entire life of a person. That's because the rules in our society that are affecting each person every single day are coming out of a system that did not, from the get-go, reach that ideal of all created equal. What we need to do is hold our elected officials accountable, hold folks accountable for the rules that they have helped to put in place, and then also undo those rules that continue to perpetuate this systemic problem.
Wonderful, thank you. And the one last question before we move to the rapid round, and Leslie, you'll get this first, is are you in support of legalizing recreational cannabis in New York State?
So I believe that we can legalize recreational cannabis in this state, but I have a couple of things that I would like to see happen simultaneously with that. And there's two components here. One is that currently the way cannabis enforcement happens in New York State severely penalizes our Black and brown populations. There are many more Black and brown people who are incarcerated or convicted or apprehended for marijuana-related offenses than white people. And we need to address that right from the get-go. So I would want to see real processes in place that are going to make sure to remedy some of those systemic problems that already exist in our penal code. Second, I would want to make sure that any profits from this come to New York cultural businesses first. Too often our upstate agricultural industry is left out in the cold when these sorts of deals are struck across the state that somehow benefit the state economically but leave upstate farmers behind. I want to see that there's a Buy New York First rule in place so that our local farmers are protected.
Great, thank you. Tom.
I have some significant concerns with the legalization of recreational marijuana at this time. I have concerns over the ability to detect intoxicated driving or to be able to evaluate an individual in the workplace as to level of intoxication or impairment on the job due to the influence of marijuana. I frankly do not see a huge distinction between the use of marijuana or alcohol in our society. And in fact, we have decriminalized the possession of up to 2 ounces of marijuana in New York State. The only thing we have not done is legalize the sale of it. And until we get the other factors that I mentioned, the ability to test driving while impaired and safety in the workplace, I don't think we're ready to go forward. I'm not a 1960s reefer madness anti-marijuana individual. I was the first Republican in the state Senate to co-sponsor the medical marijuana legislation. And I believe that that's an appropriate use of marijuana because it has medicinal effects, and they've been very effective in certain treatment areas. You know, I think we're going to get there someday. I don't think we should be moving forward to it at this time, just for the revenue reasons that the governor and the majorities of the legislature are looking at it. We spend enough money in New York State with $176 billion. We don't need to be worried about another $300 million of revenue coming from the sale of marijuana.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, so now we will move on to the last part of the session before we move on to closing statements, and this is a rapid round. So what I would ask you to do is to limit your, when I say one word, so I limit it to one word, or if I say one sentence, to limit it to one sentence, or phrase. So if I say phrase, then please limit it to one phrase. And so I'll ask you 2, 3, 4, well, depending on time, 5 questions, maybe 4, in rapid succession. And I guess, so we started with Leslie the first section, so we'll start with Tom for the first one. So the first question is, in the new session, what is the first bill you would sponsor?
I would sponsor the elimination of all taxes on manufacturing entities in New York State. We need to get our manufacturing economy back. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot we didn't.
Yeah, just the bill.
I would continue my efforts for manufacturing. Sorry.
No worries. Thank you. Leslie, what is the first bill you would sponsor?
I would introduce a bill to whack property taxes in half by removing the Medicaid mandate and making Medicaid actually a single payer system.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, Leslie, I'll ask you this, and this is a phrase question, so if you want to limit it to a phrase, what do you think is the single most pressing issue facing our state?
Not being able to support a family on the income you can earn.
Right, and Tom, what is the single most pressing issue facing our state?
Our business unfriendly climate in New York that creates what Leslie just mentioned. Okay,
and this is a yes or no question, and from the public. So this will go to Tom first. Do you publicly pledge to make a COVID-19 vaccination when it is developed and safe to use, free and available to all New York residents?
I certainly hope to see that. We should be able to find the resources to be able to do that between federal and state governments.
Leslie, do you publicly pledge to make a COVID-19 vaccination when it is developed and safe to use, free and available to all New York residents?
Yes.
Great, thank you. And Leslie, this is another phrase question. And so you will go first. What are the main differences between you and the other candidates seeking this office?
I will work for one interest, and that is the people of the Southern Tier and the Finger Lakes. My opponent does not.
Okay, and Tom? So what is the main difference between you and the other candidate seeking this?
I'm honest and straightforward. I can't say the same for my opponent.
Okay.
We have in common our views on each other.
So this is the last question, and again, also from the audience. And this will go to you, Leslie, first. If you could describe the president's performance last night in one word, what would it be? And what would be one word to describe Vice President Biden's performance?
For the president, it was childish. And for Vice President Biden, it was tolerant.
Okay, and Tom, if you could describe the president's performance in one word, what would it be? And also the Vice President Biden's in one word, what would it be?
Unpresidential for both of them.
Okay. So those are the rapid round questions. And so I think we will finish a little bit early. So we'll actually move on now to closing statements. We will start with Leslie, and then we will end with Tom, and then I'll just make some concluding remarks about next week, and also just remind people to vote. So, and Tom, I might just ask you if you don't mind. I think there is an issue. If you don't mind just turning off your video while Leslie is speaking, and then we'll do vice versa. So I think that is the reason why both people did not necessarily why both people came on screen. So we just want the one person on screen for this, if that's possible.
Okay, let me see. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to, so Leslie, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you very much to Cornell for hosting this debate and to Senator Tom O'Mara for joining me here tonight. And I'm speaking directly to all the voters who are out there listening and doing your very best to exercise your constitutional obligation to hold those of us who are seeking your vote accountable for what we say and do here. And I would like to ask the honor of your vote. I have worked very hard in this region, and I am excited to keep on working very hard for this region to make sure that we get the fair share that we deserve and that we have not received for the last 40 years, and especially for the last 10 years that my opponent has been in office. You've heard some really clear differences between the two of us. Mr. O'Mara believes that it's fine that he works a side job at a lobbying firm where the corporations that employ that firm have business before the Senate. I do not believe that that's fine. We both believe that property taxes should be cut. Mr. O'Mara has been there for 10 years and has not achieved this. I intend to introduce a bill immediately upon election that would cut property taxes and address the Medicaid for-profit program that is bankrupting our state. These are significant differences between the two of us, and I think it comes down to this. We can't keep on making the same choice and expecting things to change. I hope that you will take a very close look at the two candidates and that I will earn your vote on November 3rd, or if you mail by absentee, anytime that you stick that in the mail. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leslie. And I'll just ask you to do the same. So Tom, whenever you're ready, I want to turn on your video.
Is my mic on?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Cornell, for sponsoring this event. It's been a wonderful evening and a very quick hour and a half. I think it's worthwhile to dedicate some time in this closing to remembering one thing I believe we can depend on and turn to. That is, since I was growing up in Chemung County and then later beginning to get involved in public service and starting to raise my own family here, I've always been struck by our regional representatives' ability and important tradition of pulling together to get the job done. That's important, and it's more important than ever right now. To counter a couple Leslie's points in her closing, I believe in a strong citizen legislature, and it's important that individuals work in the real working world as our founding fathers determined and set up the system in that way. This should be a part-time legislature. With regards to property taxes, nobody has fought harder to reduce property taxes. And with the Medicaid cap and the property tax cap that I supported, sponsors, and put in place over the years, we have saved a combined $44 billion in county property tax growth that we have not seen because of those actions. At a time when government appears to be falling down in too many other places, I think it's important to recall what has gone on for generations that has helped our region weather the storms, the economic downturns, and so many other crises. It's the tradition of service that I believe has served our communities, working together to carry on for the good of our communities. And over the past 6 months, we have once again responded and renewed our commitment to each other and the region we have always called home. I promise to keep joining together with all of you to keep doing our best, and I'm confident this ongoing teamwork will see us through. Thank you, and I would be honored to receive your vote. Good evening.
Great, thank you. And Leslie, you can come back if you'd like. Great. So on behalf of IOPGA, I would like to thank both of our participants here tonight. Thank you for a very informational session and debate, which was hopefully very informative for the voters out there. If we can go back, so I encourage everybody to vote. I'm going to put up a slide again here. So just to remind you about going out and voting. here's the information. So please remember to go out and vote. And we will be posting this video on the IOPGA website. So if you have friends that weren't able to attend, they hopefully can be able to watch. And we look forward to seeing you next week. And again, a big thank you to our 2 candidates. Thank you very much for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Thank you so much.